don't understand how we can ultimately dismantle any of it if we don't stick to a intensely radical politics.
You're not broke if you're taxing rich people.
We break production for profit and we replace it by production for need.
This event is brought to you by Haymarket Books. Now more than ever, it is critical to support independent publishers, independent bookstores, and independent voices. There are two ways you can do this today. First, by buying books from Haymarket at haymarketbooks.org. And secondly, by joining the Haymarket Book Club. The following event will be recorded and shared afterwards on the Haymarket Books YouTube channel. Please subscribe to the channel, like this video now, and share it with as many people as possible. If you like this event, be sure to catch these upcoming events in Haymarket's live stream series. You can register for these upcoming events on the Haymarket Books Eventbrite page. If you miss an event, you can listen to the recording afterward by subscribing to our podcast, Haymarket Live, wherever you get your podcasts. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. We are moderating the chat, but we cannot guarantee that everyone will observe our community guidelines. People who violate these guidelines will have their comments deleted as quickly as we are able. This event will have live closed captions. Instructions for accessing the captions will be posted in the chat. We should have time for Q&A, so please post your questions in the YouTube chat window, and we'll get to those later in the program. Thanks for joining us today. Our event will begin shortly.
Welcome to our audience from across many different time zones. I'm Steve Shalom from Internationalism from Below, the host of this forum. Internationalism from Below is a network of socialist activists building solidarity and cultivating cross-movement learning among emancipatory struggles and social movements around the world. We are glad to have Haymarket Books as our partner for our political education events. Additional co-sponsors for this event include, in the United States, New Politics Journal, the Tempest Collective, and the organization Solidarity. In Ukraine, Commons, a journal of social criticism, and the democratic socialist organization Sotsialny Ruch, Social Movement, and the East European left-wing website Left East. We are meeting at a time of deep sadness. There is a massive humanitarian tragedy unfolding in Ukraine as the Russian invaders have been increasingly slaughtering civilians. And the invasion will have a profound effect as well on the future of world politics, as relations between nuclear-armed powers hit their lowest point in at least 60 years. In some ways, it seems inappropriate to even be holding a discussion about Ukraine while people are being blown apart. One of our speakers, Denis Pilash, is still in Ukraine. We wrote to him several times explaining that we fully understood if he couldn't be part of our program. He replied that no, he wanted to participate and that doing so was now more important than ever. We are in awe at his bravery and have nothing but admiration for the brave resistance of the Ukrainian people. We have 3 expert panelists with us today. I will introduce each one of them before they speak, and they will each talk for about 15 minutes. I will then ask a few questions, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. Please use the chat feature on the right side of your screen to pose a question, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can. At the end, we will allow each of the speakers to make some brief closing remarks. Our first speaker is Hanna Perekota. She is a native of Donetsk in eastern Ukraine and has family there. She is a doctoral student at the Institute of Political Studies at the University of Lausanne and a member of Solidarité Suisse in Vaud Canton, Switzerland. Her research examines debates over the Ukrainian question among the Bolsheviks, and thus is especially timely for us today because it allows her to shed light on the claim by Vladimir Putin on the eve of his invasion that Ukraine is not a real state. She will also tell us something about the campaign in Switzerland building solidarity with the Russian anti-war movement. Hanna.
Thank you very much. I hope you hear me well. Thanks for the invitation, and I hope my intervention about the historical aspect of this conflict could help us to understand a little bit more what is happening in Vladimir Putin's head right now. So, well, I will not spend more of your time. I will start, and I would also like Shin to show the first picture I sent him with the quotes of Vladimir Putin, so you can have quotes and read them if there is a possibility to share. So 2 weeks ago, in his speech dedicated to the military invasion of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin exposed his vision of the world and the history in details. So he explained that Ukrainians do not exist. Their identity is kind of a pure invention, and that Ukrainian state is a mistake. More than that, it's a crime. It's not just a mistake, it's a crime against the Russian state, the Russians who lost their empire because of Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Putin is particularly angry about the Lenin's concept of the USSR as a federative state, saying it was a time bomb that contributed to the breakup of the Soviet Union, and Putin perceived it as the biggest catastrophe of the 20th century. On the contrary, Putin acknowledges that Stalin had renounced Lenin's ideas and made a centralized and totally unitary state in the borders of a former Russian empire. And Putin praises Stalin and only criticizes him for not having revised the Leninist principles. In other words, he criticized him for not having totally abolished this formal independence of the Soviet republics. Putin portrays the Ukrainian state as a kind of illegitimate creation, as an act of theft from Russia. I do not know if among you there are people who agree with this kind of statements. I hope not. But even among those who do not question Ukrainians' historic right to independent statehood, it is common to assume that its borders are artificial in some way. Many people are convinced that the southeastern regions of Ukraine should be considered as a part of Russia that was accidentally gave or lost to Ukraine. And since 2014, Putin says it was the Bolsheviks and Lenin himself who would have attached historically Russian regions to Ukraine. So let's see if it has something to do with the real historical events. And I will ask if Shin could share the second picture. I don't know if it is the case. I hope you can see the second picture with maps. So it was the Bolsheviks who had to actually solve the problem of the borders between Russia and Ukraine and other Soviet states, because they won the struggle for power and to draw the boundaries of Ukraine that was previously a part of a centralized empire. It's not an easy task. So the first map shows that actually in the 19th century, the territory of present-day Ukraine was divided into three parts, into three so-called governorates general that were a form of colonial administration aimed to consolidate power in the non-Russian territories. And these these colonial administrations were gradually abolished, but its imperial heritage didn't simply disappear without leaving any traces. And actually in the 1917, there were three main Soviet centers in Ukraine, in Kiev, in Odessa, and in Kharkov. So in the three biggest Ukrainian cities. And this division between these three regions largely overlaps the map of Tsarist administrative regions. And actually the Bolshevik Party, the cells of Bolshevik Party appeared also in the same manner they appeared where the worker Soviets emerged, so in Kiev, in Odessa, and in Kharkiv. Even if Bolshevik Party activists during the revolution, they were convinced that their ultimate goal is a world revolution, and they didn't want to consider national or cultural barriers. These national cultural barriers existed. For example, Bolsheviks were considered themselves as representatives of workers, and most of urban workers in Ukraine were living in these big cities, Russian-speaking big cities. And as Bolsheviks didn't aim to address the majority of the Ukrainian population, the peasants, the question of Ukraine was not on their agenda. But there was also the third political actor. It's Ukrainian non-Bolshevik socialists, and for them, Ukrainian territories were those territories where Ukrainians represented the majority of the population. And defined in these terms, Ukraine actually included all the regions that we can see on the map. Almost all the regions that we can see on the map of contemporary Ukraine. So the eastern part, the southern part, that are actually our objects of interest. Of course, they were perceived as Ukrainian territories, because even in these regions, we had of course, we had a few urban centers of imperial Russian domination, but these urban centers were still in the regions where a rural Ukrainian population had a very large majority over the urban Russian-speaking one. So when the Bolsheviks in 1917 took power in the Russian capital, in Ukraine, in Kiev, it was not them but the national Ukrainian movement who consolidated its position. And to fight this competitor, this political competitor, and to take power, Bolsheviks had to actually cut the ground from under the feet of these Ukrainian politicians. This means they needed to present their own political project of Ukraine, and they needed to adopt some national symbols, some national discourse, because the idea of Ukrainian state became truly popular, capable of mobilizing the popular masses. That's why, and that's how the Soviet Republic of Ukraine was actually proclaimed by the Bolsheviks. So we are very far away from this so-called invention of Ukraine that Vladimir Putin tries to explain to us. It was not invented by the Bolsheviks. On the contrary, the national idea was so dynamic and in Ukraine that Bolsheviks had no other choice than to imitate it and then to follow it in practice. Actually, there was another group of Bolshevik activists in the eastern part of Ukraine that thought that there was no longer any sense to maintain to make a Soviet Ukrainian state, and they wanted to actually build the future Soviet Union as a union of not of national republics, but as a union of economic entities. So, of course, all these Bolshevik militants had different identities, different cultural identities, and even national. But beyond this, they had a disagreement at that time, a very big disagreement over the very definition of what socialist state must be. What does it mean? And according to those Bolsheviks who opposed the idea of socialist Ukraine, they thought that to give a national territory, to give a national form to a Soviet state was a counter-revolutionary act in itself. On the contrary, they believed that the idea of establishing a state based on the criterion of economic relevance was rational and progressive. And at that time, in 1917, many, if not the majority of party members, believed that the socialist revolution solves automatically the so-called national questions. And as one of them wrote, he wrote that creating Ukraine, even the Soviet one, would be a very reactionary decision. And by saying that, he believed that he was defending a truly Marxist view of the world and of history. But in practice, it was a defense of the Russian Empire and of its colonial structures. How much time do I have so I can conclude maybe? 4 minutes. So the main question that remains is why actually Soviet authorities, even in a moment when they were almost losing the war, why they continued to insist that the Soviet Ukraine must be a separate state and must include southern and eastern regions. Actually, Bolshevik leaders began to realize that the Soviet Ukrainian state has some long-term benefits, and their strategy was actually to take the lead in this process, inevitable process of decolonization. And this anti-colonial popular will was indeed extremely strong in Ukraine, even more than in other regions of empire. That's why Bolshevik leaders and Vladimir Lenin, they opted for this national principle in the construction of the Soviet Union. They hoped by attributing a territory to every Soviet nation, they hoped to preserve this territorial integrity of the former empire. But this policy of state-sponsored nation building was carried out within the framework of a centralized state with an economic and administrative structure of quasi-colonial type. So this knot of contradictions has never been really untied, and now it represents a significant challenge for many countries in this post-Soviet space who were deprived of real national, political and economic sovereignty up until 1991. And in the continuity with its long imperial history, Putin's Russia continued to exercise its brutal dominance over its ex-colonies, putting forward some kind of irredentist historical arguments to justify its imperialist policies. And now Russian imperialism kills Ukrainian civilians, and it's a reality we need to face it. This is actually now an imperialism driven by the resentment of a fallen empire. It's a kind of an imperialism of a state that don't have any alternative political or economical project to propose to the world, and it can only rely on its military force. So this is also an imperialism convinced of defending a conservative vision of the world, refuting any democratic ideas, and any attempt of democratic change is something Putin destroys every time without mercy, not only in Ukraine, but also in Georgia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, in Syria, and in other countries. But above all, he destroys it in his own country. And far from the claims about, far from the claims about the threat of NATO, which is a subject in itself, but it's indeed, for me, as I see it, it's against this democratic aspiration of people that Putin wages his personal war, and he wages this war for years already. And the invasion of Ukraine, it is the culmination of this process that the West didn't want to face up, actually. And this is the case of Western imperialist countries, as well as the case of Western anti-imperialist intellectuals. I think we were all blind and deaf, and we were kind of locked in our Western centered vision. So thanks for your attention, and I hope to, I'm waiting for a discussion. Thank you very much.
Economics, politics, history, and culture. He's going to talk to us about current developments. Dennis.
Indeed, we are now living in a real nightmare, an existential horror. We have a situation when Russia's right-wing conservative dictatorship unilaterally attacked a neighboring country, and that already has brought deaths of thousands of civilians, and actually tens of millions of lives have been broken. So many people were they had to flee to another place. It's not just that 1.5 million Ukrainians who left the country, but also many more who who are now scattered throughout the safer regions in Ukraine. But many also had no option. They couldn't leave, and they are now. Many of these people are our close friends, the people whom we care and love, who are now under the shellings and airstrikes of Russian military in Kiev, in Kharkiv, in other cities. Many couldn't leave because they have their elder relatives, because they have their different health issues, because they have their pets, and so on and so on. And actually, lots of cities, towns, they have been almost destroyed by the Russian army. Izum, Shastya, Volnovaha, suburbs of Kiev. And actually, there is another side of this aggression, of Putin's aggression, is that he didn't expect, and the circles whom he represents, they didn't expect such enormous resistance by both the Ukrainian armed forces and by the local population alike. When people, common people, mainly working class people, both Ukrainian, Russian-speaking, or from some another ethnic communities as well, you could see these videos of people in Kherson, in Melitopol, in Berdyansk, in Enerhodar, the city with nuclear power plant, in Karyukivka, and a lot of them that are defying the Russian military, that are even stopping Russian armed vehicles with their bare hands, and who are not afraid of standing up to armed occupiers. And that's a situation when actually this, what Hanna has previously described, this Putinist narrative, that if you listen to his warmongering speeches, he often invokes the socialist revolution, Bolsheviks, Lenin personally, as culprits of the mere existence of Ukraine, and he denies any kind of subjectivity, any kind of agency of the Ukrainian people. So his agenda, it's really a continuation of this great Russian chauvinism and Tsarist imperialism. In some way, he acts as Nicholas I was called the gendarme of Europe for crushing revolutions throughout the continent, and he also acts as this policeman in his sphere of influence, suppressing protests in Kazakhstan, in Belarus, and so on. And actually, we have a situation that is in some ways similar to another great, not great, but notorious actually war crime of 21st century, that was 2003 invasion of Iraq. And just as George W. Bush and Tony Blair and their satellites felt that they will hold on their impunity for the aggression and for just attacking a country without thinking about long-term consequences and bringing around disaster for the entire region. This was the case with the Russian aggression against Ukraine. So we got this situation that is now already disastrous, already catastrophic, that brought enormous suffering and death in Ukraine, but that has also this potential of spilling into something even worse for the entire world. So this using threats of nuclear war and so on. So I think that there is another parallel that has to be drawn with that another invasion almost two decades ago, the anti-war movement. So first of all, it's about the aid in supporting Ukrainian resistance and Ukrainian people, humanitarian aid, humanitarian supplies, medicine, and so on, and also supporting Ukrainians who many of them we are now doing like huge solidarity projects, establishing solidarity networks, and many people went volunteering into different initiatives. It's not just about the military or territorial self-defense. It's also about relieving those who were affected by the war. And this transcends to another question of aiding refugees from Ukraine. That means all refugees, regardless of their citizenship, of some other specifications. And it means also a debate about the plight of the millions of refugees throughout the world. And by providing all support for Ukrainian refugees, we also need to consider all that discrimination, xenophobia, and racism that refugees throughout the world are facing every day. In order to rebuild the country, in order to give the opportunity to resist and to overcome, another important demand is canceling Ukraine's debt, because Ukraine, as many countries, especially in the global south, were trapped in this vicious circle of debt, gaining more and more these IMF loans on austerity programs, and while this business as usual, it leads to more suffering and more deadlocks. In order to restore the possibilities for Ukrainians and for the country as a whole, we need a serious steps on relieving Ukrainian foreign debt. Again, when we speak about pressure put on Russia, there were already these sanctions against Russian oligarchs, but still they are not enough, because actually Russian oligarchs, Ukrainian oligarchs, and the global capitalist class as such, it uses all the loopholes that are provided by the existing system of tax havens, offshore capitalism, and so on. So it's again about dismantling this system that was actually helping the capitalist classes to rob their own countries, to rob other countries, and to put this money to tax havens. Again, this needs a complete withdrawal of the global system as well. Again, when we speak about such regimes as Putin's regime in Russia, or another moderate regimes as Saudi Arabia waging their own war in Yemen, well, they are very dependent on these fossil fuel exports. And again, Europe is now considering a complete withdrawal from Russian oil and gas. And this brings us to another consideration about all these issues of climate disaster, climate justice, Green New Deal, and possibly much more radical eco-socialist transformations that are needed in order to preserve not just those countries that are now under attack of these fossil fuel authoritarian regimes, but the humanity as a whole. Then, of course, there is this important issue of that we cannot guarantee stability for Ukraine and for the region as a whole when if the current regime in Moscow is still going on. So I think that this was really a moment of revelation when many people who were trapped into this so-called anti-imperialist, but actually turning blind eye on some other imperialisms other than Western one way of thinking. And they realized how dangerous that authoritarian regime in Russia is for its own citizens and for the people across the world. However, probably it was too late, but still now we need to put all political pressure on Russian regime, and of course to overthrow it, it's a task for the Russians themselves. And I must say that though I was sure in my comrades in Russia, who are most of them from socialist, anarchist or democratic milieu, who were protesting since the first days in the streets, and many of them were among these thousands who were arrested. However, they themselves are very pessimistic, they are very skeptical, and they say that though there is no mass enthusiasm about this another Putin's war, however, the society is very passive, and they are far from this wishful thinking scenario when again, as Nicholas II started a small victorious war against Japan that resulted in some miserable defeat, failure, and then the first Russian Revolution, and many now are hoping for some kind of this scenario in Russia. But it cannot be done by some mechanistic or miraculous steps. It's really a long way forward, and still we cannot say something. We cannot say something certain about the prospects of this anti-war movement in Russia, especially in this situation of complete suppression and long-term prison sentences that are many of these people will be facing. But anyway, I thank on behalf of our organization, Social Movement, and our Commons Journal, to all international comrades, especially on the left, who were showing their solidarity and their help in these days. Thanks.
Thank you, Dennis, for that powerful presentation. Our final speaker is Catherine Samari. Catherine is an economist by training and was, until her retirement, a lecturer at Dauphine University in Paris. She is the author of Yugoslavia Dismembered. She's a frequent contributor to Le Monde Diplomatique and is associated with the journal and network Balkanology. She's a member of the Scientific Council of Attaque France and serves on the International Committee of the Fourth International. Catherine is going to speak about the response of the international left to the Ukraine crisis. Catherine.
First of all, thank you very much for organizing this meeting. I'm currently involved in France and in Europe for the building of the equivalent of the British collective, which on the Solidarity Ukraine campaign, and also to try and build at not only European, but and when I say European, I mean the continent, not the European Union, and not only people inside the European Union, but on the continent and up to Russia, Ukraine, of course, but also at a broader level on all continents, the building of what you try to build now here, that is the building of from below of an anti-imperialist movement, which first urgent aim is to help Ukrainian resistance, of course, and defeat Putin. I want to say, of course, that I have to present the disagreements and debates which are occurring among the left, and my purpose in doing that is not for futile polemics, but to engage in a real effort using the impressive impact of Ukraine resistance in that war to change even the situation among the international left, its weakness, and to engage in a real front in the building of a common effort to defeat Putin's, and in so doing also defeat all capitalist and imperialist powers. So building something which is not a short-term issue. Some roots of the disagreements, existing disagreements, are of course long-term, not linked only to the war, and could be changed through the war. I want to begin with these long-term disagreements behind the need of updating different views. First, I will not develop, but behind what Anna said, and also Dennis, I mean, there is still, and there were strong disagreements at the moment of the Bolshevik revolutions on national issues, Marxist and national issues, different views, and those questions are to be updated. And there is a very impressive work made by Ukrainian Marxists on what were the archives and the real debate that Marxist Ukrainian tried to put forward at the time of the October Revolution and within the Comintern. This has to be popularized and debated and updated. Is not only a question of Ukrainian, it's most broader issue on the concept of Marxist and socialist transformation combined with not only class exploitation, but different forms of oppressions combined within a class exploitation. Second, of course, there was different long-term divisions among the left about USSR and Stalinist rule. And Putin, a declaration which Anna quoted, help precisely like also Denis said, help stressing the key position that Putin is attacking, that is Leninist recognition of the right of self-determination of nations against great Russian behaviors and thinking within the Bolshevik movement itself, as it has been said, and against Stalin. Of course, there is a broad and long-term Great Russian ideology, chauvinism, which also crossed the left, a part of the left. And of course, Putin is in agreement with Stalin non-respect about that. And of course, there was an attempt of Ukrainization of Ukraine under Lenin's rule, but then the Great Russian policy against Ukraine under Stalin's domination. Third, of course, but I must say that, of course, the far right in Ukraine and elsewhere also is against the Lenin's kind of recognition of equalitarian right of nations and self-determination. And this anti-Leninist Putin's rule is supported by part of the far right in the world and in Ukraine too. There is, of course, the debates which occurred among the left about the post-Soviet phase, that is after 1989 and 91 up to today. And this is not homogeneous, and of course debates must deepen debate about first Ukraine, two NATO, third Russia. About Ukraine, I remind, of course, to everyone listening to us, you here know that very well, that in 1991 there was a vote on self-determination in Ukraine, which was building a real nation state. And it's, of course, fragile, and it didn't solve all the conflicting view of the past, anti-Stalinist and anti-fascist combined debate are needed. But there was more than 80% everywhere, up to 80% votes, including in the Donbass region, and including, even if it was a lower level of vote of support for independence, but including in Crimea, there was nearly 60% in favor of independence, including, by the way, the Tatar from Crimea, which had been repressed by Stalin. Even if there are discussion in the Ukrainian society about the organization of that society, both on linguistic aspect, on territorialization of it, it's the issue to be dealt with by Ukrainians themselves, not to be decided outside and not to be imposed by any external rule. And I must remind also, first, of course, that in that period between 91 and today, there is another treaty. It was said that Putin did not respect. That was the treaty on nuclear weapons, respecting in 1996 in Budapest. Russia accepted to respect the frontier of Ukraine when Ukraine and Belarus and Kazakhstan gave back to Russia the nuclear arms. So this was not respected by Putin. And of course, Ukraine entered to big crisis, economic crisis, the post-Soviet crisis, but also the crisis in 2008, 2009, and to political conflict. The one which was described by Putin and part of the left as colored revolution in 2004, putting aside for the first time Yanukovych. But after the economic crisis of 2008 and 9, Yanukovych came back through elections, for a supposedly a neutral Ukraine. And he was confronted to pressures from Russian great power, and also IMF and United to European Union on the question of the debt issue. That's why I fully, completely support Denis's insistence on the issue of the debt, because that was, of course, an issue for the events in 2013 and 14. But Yanukovych power, who was clearly transformed into an oligarchic and repressive and kind of power, decided by himself and not putting the question of how to deal with the debt confronted to the IMF or to the Russian pressure through a democratic process. And that was the deep reason of his fall, not a fascist coup. Well, then, of course, I'll come back on that, but there was, of course, different views among the left on the transformation of NATO, which is still a debate today. Of course, there was an politically illegitimate maintenance of NATO after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact in 1991. And there was that NATO extension. Was it against Russia? And is it the cause of the war? Certainly not. First of all, I must stress that there were different phases. And during the 90s, that is during Yeltsin reign, Russia was like a comprador bourgeoisie in a not so bad relationship with international capital, and including NATO, and was in a partnership with NATO. But there was a turn towards what has been called a new form of Cold War in the after 1999 and the years of Putin. Up to now. It's both a combination of transformation in the world order and the Yugoslav war, of course, which was used by US power and NATO to consolidate itself and to maintain and extend. But Putin's line is not only or not even, first of all, a defensive at all, a defensive position. It is an offensive imperial and great Russian policies of consolidation of strong states, both internally and internationally, not for defensive, but for increasing of what can be called a regional, new imperialist power, using what occurred in particular, well, first of all, in Chechnya, it was not an issue linked with NATO, but it was a great Russian destructive war. Secondly, there was the, to give only example, of the recent period, the event in Belarus, and Lukashenko was asking for Putin's help in front of upsurge against his own rule. And this has been a very recent turn towards the consolidation of a great Russian power in the region with its military dimension. And this military dimensions has also to be stressed. That is linked to the Euro-Asiatic project of building an economic union around Russia. There is the organization of the Treaty for Collective Security around Russia, which intervened in the recent events of Kazakhstan protecting, by the way, foreign ownership there, not only Russian, Kazakhstan, but also, of course, Western capitalists there against working class upsurge, which we of course have to support. So these are the context of real great Russian offensive policies, and probably at the eve of its intervention in February, Putin thought that first American NATO, US-led NATO was weak because of Afghanistan defeat. Second, that it was divided because of division on gas issue in Europe. And third, Putin's Russia was supposed to be stronger, and then it could put forward this extraordinary reactionary Great Russian narrative against the very existence of Ukrainian identity, history, and national reality. Of course. Well, then I must hurry a little bit. The issue of 2014 left an heritage of dual view among the left. First one, a democratic movement, pro-European Union or something like that, which is the dominant narrative in the European Union, and comrade of social movement in Ukraine, of course, contested that they could both participate to what was socially and democratically important in Maidan, but were also confronted to its limits and conflicts with the fascist groups and so on. So it's not an easy situation, but it was not a fascist coup. It was a defeat of Yanukovych because of its own policy first of all, including if far right do exist, like it exists in France, by the way, with much more power in parliament than in Ukraine. So the war is changing, and I finish this last part. The war is changing rapidly, position, situation. Some part of the left initially still support Putin against NATO and say nothing on Ukraine because of weakness I already quoted before. But there is an increasing part of the left which is denouncing the war and invasion with a different argument. First, there is Jaurès pacifism against war, like in the World War I. So I must try and stop now, but I must say that there is precisely an opposition, and I finish on that, opposition to this argument with the idea that the situation is not that we have only to fight against our own imperialist powers in different countries, but we have to link and combine NATO, a fundamental fight for the defeat of Putin's and Russian aggression, but combined also for a new order and with the concrete demands which Denis has put forward that I completely support, with the idea of to build an anti-imperialist European and global movement from below, centered on the defense of autonomous position, condemnation of Russian aggression, preserve the possibility of a truly independent Ukraine left, refound an internationalism capable of confronting and defeating both the force of social and environmental destruction in the capital, but also immediately supporting the need for self-defense, including military self-defense of Ukrainian resistance, while opposing budgets of NATO and consolidation of NATO. I stop there. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Catherine. Okay, so I'm going to ask a question to each of you, and then I'm going to turn to the questions from the audience. My first question is for Hannah. Could you tell us something about the Russian-speaking population of Ukraine? That is, do they see themselves as part of the distinct country of Ukraine, Ukrainians, or do they think of themselves as Russians?
So do you want me to answer right now? That's right. Okay.
Yes.
This is not an easy question. Well, in a historical perspective, as I said, we need to face and to understand the colonial heritage of the Russian Empire on the territory of contemporary Ukraine. The linguistic problem in Ukraine, the linguistic difference, the use of Russian and Ukrainian language is not just geographical. There is not just geographical difference, but it's a difference of between urban and rural population mostly. And for decades and for centuries, the Ukrainian language was perceived as a language of poor peasants, illiterate, and the language of elites. The language of social ascension was Russian. And even if there was some promoting national policies in Soviet Union promoting Ukrainian language and culture, it was the situation was not radically different from the previous time. I'm just trying to say that Russian language was a language that was seen and perceived, and de facto was the language that permitted, that gave the possibility to people to have a social ascension, and not the Ukrainian language. So there is kind of a very, how to say, the attitude from the Russian speaking population and from Russia to Ukraine in Ukrainian language is not the equal perception. It's a perception from somebody who is above to directed to somebody who is below. And so we need to understand this aspect. And in me, as I was born and grown up in independent Ukraine, and I had my scholarship partly in Ukrainian, people of my age and of my generation don't have any problem using both languages. And most of us in the whole Ukraine, East and West, who are using and can use both and actually doing that without any problem. And it doesn't provoke any conflict of identity or a conflict between people. And with the Russian aggression, the start of Russian aggression in 2014, more and more of a Ukrainian Russian-speaking population doesn't identify itself based on their language, but based on their civic Ukrainian identity. And I think it will be more and more the case because Putin now is bombing Russian-speaking population in Russian-speaking cities like Kharkiv, like Mariupol, most of the big cities in Ukraine. There are a lot of Russian-speaking people there, and they are opposing vigorously. They are opposing Russian occupants with barehanded trying to stop their tanks, and this is also the great danger for Putin, as that Russian soldiers going to occupy Ukraine, they are speaking the same language as people living there, so they can identify themselves to the Ukrainian population very easily. These are the people who can speak the same language. I hope I answered partially on the question, but and sorry for my English. It's not a language that I use every day in a normal life.
My Ukrainian is much worse. Dennis, you told us what you thought the Western powers should do now. What might they have done over the past years to have made this current war less likely?
the governments, but about the peoples, because actually I think that meaningful change can be brought only by this pressure from below. And actually we saw that all great powers, including those on the West, they were quite convenient with considering Ukraine and all these countries as not so something not so important and not so deserving its own agency. So again, in these dealings, it was pretty much about what they denied, that they aren't solving the fate of Ukraine without Ukraine. However, that was the goal of Putin, and many in the West were also eager to march into it. And again, they were guided by their own economic interests, the interests to preserve, for instance, affordable fossil fuels from Russia and so on, to continue business as usual with Russia. And again, it was a half-baked position on that aggressive actions of Russia that were already taken in 2014, like the annexation of Crimea and fueling the war in Donbass. So actually, I think there is now a more or less common point that there was a failure by this collective West. But again, it's due to the nature of these governments as well. And sometimes, even now, you can hear President Zelensky's rant about some passivity, as he perceives from the West, or that the West is okay for Ukrainians dying, but really choosing not to endanger its own interests. So it's again about all these dealings, and here we can again invoke this problem of this so-called anti-imperialism of the fools that some of our comrades were referencing in their articles recently. I recommend Taras Bilous and Volodymyr Artyuk's recent articles. And the reaction of even part of the progressive forces that, for instance, when we demanded in our organization, we were considering that maybe UN peacekeepers could be a barrier from engraving this conflict further. And we were met with the claims that UN peacekeeping forces imperialist per se. At the same time, these same people were okay with leaders of great states, great powers, doing their dealings behind closed doors, and also deciding the fate of Ukraine and other countries. So don't be confused. The first one is imperialism. The second one is diplomacy. So this is really a broken logic that I think that now we need to do a lot of work on these mistakes that were done by many of our comrades.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Catherine, that some on the left in the past were apologists for the Soviet Union was awful, but at least the Soviet Union claimed to be a workers' state. But today, Russia is one of the world's most unequal and reactionary states. So why does Russia still enjoy support in some left circles?
First, well, I think first there was the kind of neo-Campist position based on the following discourse, that is, choose what is the dominant enemy, the main enemy, our own enemy. The main enemy is imperialism, classical imperialism. It's US, which is, even if it is in crisis, it's still dominant. It is the first power, even military power, and so on. So then there is that kind of narrative. Of course, we have to denounce US imperialist and NATO imperialist interventions in the world. But secondly, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So that there is a kind of non-critical approach, at least, towards Putin's Russia, considered as able to resist the main enemy, and therefore becoming a kind of a friend. There is even worse, of course, approach, that is, this, when I say neo-Campist, Campist means the choice of a camp. What is my enemy, main enemy? And if you are in the anti-US camp, you say nothing. You don't criticize anything about the power that you support. So nothing is said of what was Putin's policy in Syria. Nothing has been said about what was Putin's policy in Chechnya. Nothing has been said about Putin's policy, as I quoted, in Belarus, and so on. So, of course, this view depends on where you have, and there is also probably in Latin America and in Africa, because of what is US policy. I mean, there is that sentiment. So we have to fight against that kind of position, and of course there is a broad part of ignorance about the reality of the internal socio-economical and political change in Russia itself, which is a real offensive against the workers, against the different populations, and with a very radical oppression. And I do hope that the situation now, where there is, contrary to the situation after the annexation of Crimea, there is now the real beginning of an anti-war movement in Russia, and I do hope. And with position in university, position in different professions, artists, intellectuals, and also trade unions, and beginning of the building of a very difficult, because under repression, but very difficult but important resistance. And what has been said just before by Anna about the soldiers, the young soldiers sent, I think is a key issue, where, by the way, women, which can play a key role. One of the dominant resistance within Russia is among women, like it was the case in Belarus, by the way. But when soldiers come back from Ukraine, or when soldiers are killed in a war where they did not know where they were going, they thought they were fighting fascists there, and when they will come back in Russia, it will change a lot about the perception of what is really Putin's war. I do believe, I do hope.
Thank you. So we have quite a few questions in the chat, and not much time. So I'll throw out a question, and any one of you can answer it, but try to keep it very short so we can get to a bunch of them. The first question asks, what is the role of anarchists in the struggle in Ukraine? Anyone like to take that?
Well, I can. Still, given the rather poor situation of anarchist, as in general, leftist movement in Ukraine and in Eastern Europe in general, the people whom I know, they do lots of activities now, and they initiated several solidarity groups and solidarity networks. Some of them enlisted to this territorial self-defense. Others have been providing humanitarian aid, donating blood, and keeping things running in the cities that are now under Russian attacks. So I think that though the number and the general mood of the anarchist movement here was rather low, but they are now trying to do their best to help the people.
How can Ukrainian socialists outmaneuver the increasingly armed Ukrainian ultra-far right? Who would like to take that?
If no one, then again I'll have to do it. Well, that's an issue, and okay, so here we have to confront both pictures that are dominant in narratives in the West. The first one that is just downplaying the problem of the far right in Ukraine, saying they have very low electoral support, and that's true. They have no real mass social base. They are deeply unpopular in the majority of Ukrainian population. But the other one is about when speaking of Ukraine, you have this synonymous situation. Ukraine equals fascism, equals Azov battalion, and so on and so on. The reality is much more complex. And again, though the far right is weak electorally, but it has its institutions, and it has, of course, armed people. Even those countries in Europe where the far right gets enormous results on the elections, they, of course, don't have this situation with armed groups. However, what's important to emphasize that to deal with this problem, with this challenge, is something that needs to be done by Ukrainian society itself. And when someone is still going on this Russian propaganda that the incursion of Putin's forces to Ukraine is somehow bringing on denazification, it's not just a blatant lie, it's something that is opposite to the reality. Of course, first of all, the right-wing Russian regime that is worshipped by, I think, majority of European far right, and even when it invokes these mantras of anti-fascism, it's again just prior to the invasion, Putin was meeting with such great anti-fascists as Viktor Orban from Hungary and Jair Bolsonaro from Brazil, and they are going to hold an anti-fascist congress in half a year, and many prominent anti-fascists will be also featured, like the government of Saudi Arabia and Narendra Modi from India. So you can sees the level of this anti-fascism. But the problem is that it's precisely this situation of war and Russian aggression that fuels the Ukrainian far right, and that gives it legitimacy, and that gives it arms. So it's really the Russian invasion is doing something opposite to denazification. It really boosts this legitimacy of the far right, because actually when you have a society, in any society, the majority of people don't want war. Actually, it's this minority of ultranationalists who are somehow dreaming of great war and going to Valhalla and so on. And now they have the opportunity, and now they have the opportunity to present themselves to the general population as the great warriors and the great defenders of the motherland. I genuinely, I don't have an answer how we can outmaneuver it, but what gives me hope is that even in this situation of fueling nationalist aspirations in the countries in the times of war, you see that the real and most significant resistance comes from the people who are quite far from all this nationalist and far right stuff. It's just these common people, men and women who Russian and Ukrainian speaking, who are standing up to the Russian aggression, and the number of the ultranationalists in this resistance, it's really just a drop in the sea. So I still hope for self-organization of people besides this hysteria, though it would be quite difficult.
Thank you for that. What are the most helpful non-violent actions we can take to support an end to this war?
Can I say something? Yeah, I do believe that, well, there are the issue of the debt, the issue of refugees, and the issue of concrete linked supporting the resistance on Pacific aspect. I do believe that, of course, we have to help against all discrimination on the refugee issue, but the fight to suppress the debt of Ukraine is very important as a contribution to also bring in some concrete material aid for the population. And I personally would feel that all form of fraternization with Russian soldiers and with the Russian opposition would be absolutely decisive. I will stress this.
Okay, we just have a few minutes left, and so I'd like to give you each a chance to take, I guess it's a minute and a half to sum up or say anything that you felt you didn't have an opportunity to say. Hannah, would you like to start?
Yeah, I would like to start with a little comment actually about the previous question, how we can help being in another country, in USA or in Europe. What is our tools to actually end this war, being not in Ukraine and not in Russia. Here in Switzerland, I'm actually living now and studying here in Switzerland, where organized the Committee of Solidarity with Ukrainian people and with the anti-war movement in Russia, and it's quite a large committee which involves many political and non-political organization. So we choose some points, like some statements on which we could all agree, and we can express our solidarity in a practical way. So these statements are firstly the complete withdrawal of Russian troops from all Ukrainian territory. These are something which we can agree, many organizations can agree on. Also, we are claiming to receive to open borders for all the refugees without discrimination of their country of provenience, without discrimination based on their passport or nationality. We're also claiming the solidarity with Russian opponents of Putin's war, and the main or the particularly important claim for countries like Switzerland, but also for countries like USA and Great Britain, is to ask to block the assets linked to the Putin regime, which are housed in this in banks and institutions which have their headquarters in European countries. So these countries plays a central role for Russian elites, and their big fortunes of the Russian oligarchs are kept safe in these banks. So the central point for me is to understand that Putin is waging this war to protect the interests of his clan of the rich oligarchs who are ready to make all possible barbarism, all possible wars, just to continue to exploit and to continue to gain billions on the blood of Russian and Ukrainian people. So for now, in Europe and the USA, I think one of the central points is to ask to block their assets. Thank you.
Okay, I think that Hanna has listed the main points already. I was also suggesting that maybe my comrade Denis can also say something or not. No. Okay. So I would just reassure that we need these questions like the from we are witnessing more and more deaths of our friends, our relatives, and one of the worst scenarios that we can imagine now, aside from apparently nuclear war, is that this conflict will drag to something really long and exhausting, that will completely destroy the lives of so many people. So we need this maximum assistance in these issues right now, and we need also, actually I was quite late to read all the questions, but I'm really grateful for them, and I hope that I'll be able to address them maybe personally. You can write me, find me on some social media and put it. But really, I'm grateful for being here and for having people who really believe in a left-wing progressive socialist, democratic socialist prospects for Ukraine and the whole world. So let's do our best to stop this war and to bring peace for Ukrainian people and for all other communities on our planet as well.
Thank you, Dennis. Catherine.
Many things have been said, so I will only stress 2 points. The first, that I'm sure that we are confronted to the need of an immediate, urgent, concrete aid, in which we must involve the broadest as possible of trade unions, political activists, associations, which at least agree to support Ukrainian against an aggressive war, even if there are differences. And I do believe there is the need to build that front on concrete solidarity, and at the very same time permit debate, permit fraternal debate, which is needed to consolidate for a longer time. But on both, I would say on both sides. So front with and trade unions activity is a key question on which in France I've seen there has been a position of broad parts of trade union, even CGT and so on, which could an international solidarity network of trade unions, including Belarus and Russia and so on. I think it's very important. So I stop there. Thank you very much for this, and hoping for concrete links with all the comrades involved in commons and social movement.
So thank you, all of you, for your wonderful presentations and for your being here for this. Thank you to the audience for their questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to more of them. And I have to say, Dennis and Hannah, you're the future of Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you.